Welcome to the Founders Foyer with me, Aishwarya. This foyer is full of conversations, the space where creators, founders, and builders look for all the support and concepts to grow their ideas into products. What's the hardest part about starting up? You ask. Plenty of them. And topping the chart, definitely amongst the top three, would be nailing the branding and go-to-market strategy. While our entire focus is on the target audience when we're building out the product, somewhere along the way, there are quite a number of slips and shaky edges, which takes us away from our audience. So, how exactly do you build a brand? And how do you make the first few customers understand more about your brand? How do you nail the messaging and get better at distribution? Say hello to Arielle Jackson, who is with us today to discuss everything about whatever we've been questioning, and that is startup brand strategy. Arielle helped grow companies like Gmail, who I covered during their early days, whether it was like hitting 1 million users or getting distribution to nearly like 50K people, she's the go-to person. Arielle currently is the marketer in residence at First Round Capital, and she's worked with more than 100 early stage companies, including Patreon, Loom, and even Maven on the foundational messaging. Hi, Arielle. Thank you so much for being with me here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Let's dive into starting with what was your entry like into tech, specifically marketing, and now working with startups? What brought you into this stuff?
Yeah. So I studied human biology in college and did a master's in psychology. I always thought I would be a psychologist. But during that master's program, I realized that the research is very slow and it would take me 7 more years to get a PhD. And I decided at the same time that I was working on this one topic that maybe like 5 people in the world cared about, and the impact felt really small. And so I had a friend who went to Google straight from Stanford, and he loved it. And he was like, just apply. I know you want to go do your PhD, but just think about it. So I applied. And then I was deciding between this like research role and this role at Google. And I just leapt at it and took the role at Google. And that was kind of my entry. It was very, I didn't study marketing. I did study psychology, which is related. And then I just kept going smaller. So I went to Google when it was 1,400 people. I left when it was like 14,000 people.
Wow.
And then I went to Square when it was like 100-ish people. And I left when it was like 400-ish. And then I went to a 7-person company. So I kept going smaller and smaller. And now most of the companies I work with are less than 10 people, although occasionally I'll work with a later stage company too. So yeah, I guess my start was a little random, but then I really loved it and just kept going smaller and smaller until I started working with those who are just starting up, which is really my favorite way to work.
Right. Yeah. What fascinates me about this is, so as somebody who took biology back in my high school, and pretty much the same rationale, like, you really love the subject. There's like nothing, no qualms about it. But then, as you think about, okay, where do I see the impact? And these things take time. And especially when you're this person who's extremely scrappy, who's like, oh, I just want to get this going. I just want to implement this idea. And then you're like, should I wait 10 years to do that? Like, is it really like that? So, I could like so much relate with what you were just saying. And these are like these kind of, incredible jumps, and, getting into a lot of unknown and uncertainty is what drives so much energy. And I can like, totally relate with working with early ideas, early stage people. And every time you left the company, I think it's amazing that it's quadrupled, or it's like grown like 100% and more. So a lot of stories for us to uncover for sure now.
Yeah, yeah. There was one class I took, I'm remembering now, in my master's program. I took a class on social psychology, and we actually had a guest lecture by Robert Cialdini, who is the author of Influence. And I remember in that class being like, I like this. Like it was one of those like eyes light up moments, because it was sort of the intersection of psychology with business, and like, how do you use some of those ideas to really make people feel a certain way and then act another way as well. So like you can influence people by tapping into psychology. So there is a connection, but like totally, it was a little random that I went to Google when I did.
Yeah, yeah. Like so much so that, you sort of understand the relationship only when you're actually on the job. Because often what I see is when folks enter tech, it's always about, zeros and ones. And there's like, suddenly you forget the fact that a lot of psychology is what drives people to buy products. It's what drives, customers to to spend time understanding, okay, this is the tool that's going to be solving my problem. So, when you're a product manager, you're a product marketer, you're a salesperson, customer rep, who you are, I think a lot of this is rooted in psychology. So it's funny that sometimes when you're working in tech, there's like, oh, but psychology, I thought that was different. But that's what drives our everyday work. So
Yeah.
I can like totally go with your rational around, okay, psychology and business together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get a little more into how you joined some of these teams like Gmail, Square, and Cover during those early days. And it's fascinating that, as you mentioned, those are like larger and massive orgs now. So with today's context, there's a lot of shifts happening. And how would you say when the time that you joined to now, if you have to talk to founders and tell them how to find their initial target audience, what were some lessons that you want to share with them?
Yeah. So it was interesting. I mean, I think some of the same things that you use when you're just starting out, whether what you grow ends up being used by hundreds of millions of people around the world or not, you start from the same place. Like Gmail started with, it was an idea within Google for people who
Mm,
got a lot of mail and used Google where they could search instead of sorting their mail. Like that was the idea, right? And so it started with something small. When I joined when I joined Gmail, everyone at Google had already started using Gmail. And Gmail, we had invites and we could give them out to friends. So it was already
mm,
out there in the world and it already had the like buzz, people selling invites on eBay. It was already kind of new and cool. My
yeah.
job was to help grow it and take it from, it's a thing that's in beta with invites to it's the dominant email service in the world. And so that was a different challenge because some of the early positioning and messaging had already been done.
Mm,
Whereas, and we could tweak it and we expanded upon it and refined it, but the product was already built and we added stuff. Like we added a lot of personality to it. We did a lot of really unscalable, scrappy things, even for Gmail, which is such a big thing now. But I remember like one project we did, this was before even the term like community marketing or any community management, any of that existed. But one of the things we knew was that our very, very loyal customers loved us. And one of the jobs of marketing was to amplify that love because that resulted in growth. And so we did really funny things. Like we made keyboard shortcut stickers that you could actually put onto your keyboard. And then we gave them out for free. But we did this like really analog funny thing where you had to mail us a self-addressed stamped envelope if you wanted us to send them to you. So it was like you had to handwrite your mail and like put it in the post. It was very old school. And so there was
yeah.
this kind of fun thing with like, I'm writing a letter to Gmail and they're going to send me back these stickers. And it was all free. You just had to like send the envelope to us. And so we did stuff like that. And because it was so different than what the competitors at the time were doing, like Yahoo, Hotmail, those kind of competitors, they didn't do
Mm,
anything fun like that it increased the brand love and even got us coverage. Like one of my coworkers from the Gmail team recently posted on LinkedIn a photo of these stickers and it triggered the memory. We got covered
oh,
by Wired. We got covered
wow.
by all like the tech publications at the time because it was weird. Like this big kind of growing company was doing this like weird, scrappy stuff. And so I think there's not really like, oh, you should only do this when you're small. You should only do this when you're big. Those lines can get blurred a little bit.
Mm,
But you asked
absolutely.
about
Yeah.
the foundations too, right? So the foundations are the same to me no matter what. You start with
Mm,
understanding the customer, understanding your audience. What is the psychology of that user, right? What are the needs that they have? What are the challenges they have? Are they not even thinking about your product? They're not even aware that they have the problem? Do they have a clear problem? So really start with the audience and then think about how to talk about your product offering in a way that appeals to that audience. Like those are really the fundamentals. And so that's the same, no matter if your product has millions of users or you're just getting started.
right, right. Absolutely. And I think you made a very strong point here because often when, folks introduce their companies or when they just try to say, okay, we're just starting out at early stage and probably now we have XYZ customers, there's often this mindset shift that happens. It's like, oh, so now you're from 0 to 1 and then 1 to 10 and then 10 to 100. So, which means your strategy automatically changes, which means, you know, just because you have 10 customers, now you have to start thinking about newer ways or like extremely radical, thoughts in terms of like growing stuff. So, I would come back to the fundamentals, like you mentioned, in terms of like just showing that kind of care. And like I said, doing some scrappy things that make you feel very unique. I would say, you just kindled a lot of memory in me right now, because one of the biggest tech flexes that I would still keep, even until like last week, that I kept telling my friend, is having a Gmail invite when I was probably in sixth standard. Like 2006 was when I was in sixth. And then I received this invite from one of my acquaintances in the US saying, hey, there's like Gmail launched. And I just got my email ID. Do you want one? I'm like, okay, hell yeah. I don't know what emails are for, but why not? Like, just get me
Yeah.
an invite. It's fine. And here I am in India, like not knowing what to do with Gmail, but like just fancily owning a Gmail ID. And I think my journey with Gmail and the rest of the drive and all the other things. I even remember Picasa back then, like everything was so connected. So I remember like that was my biggest tech flex growing up, saying that I own a Gmail ID. That's my full name. Like I don't have to use numbers, like my proper name.
Right.
And like rekindled a lot of memory. And I think that amount of like making users talk about your product, like they're just so proud about mentioning it to folks. So I'm so glad that some of what you said is like letting founders and early stage builders, which is listening to this podcast, to get that sort of a emotion right with their early audience.
Hmm. Yeah. I think that emotional piece can often be missing because we think about like jobs to be done as very functional. And a lot of the
Mm.
time there are functional needs, but there are also some more emotional needs. And so I always tell early stage startup founders, you have to nail the functional. You have to explain what it does. I have to be able to understand it in very plain English. At the same time, it's great if you can tap into some of the emotion that your target audience is feeling. And so for Gmail, it was a little bit about, oh, you're cool because you have a good handle on your account. It was also kind of like you were tech savvy, right? It was also like the new hotness. It's funny because I worked on Superhuman also. That's a first round
Mm.
company. And it
Yeah.
was really interesting. Like when I was working on Gmail, we were positioning against the old guard, which was, Yahoo and Hotmail. And then you work on Superhuman and who's the foil, right? Who are you positioning against? It's Gmail, really. So it's
Yeah.
fun because they kind of used a lot of the same tactics around like early access. It was more premium. It was for a different audience, but it
Mm.
really was some of the same tactics, just going against Gmail as the foil.
Wow, like that's the entry that you wouldn't have predicted. Like just going back to getting against what you had actually built in the first place. And I remember
Makes me
reading
feel
through your
old. I've been doing this 20 years. It makes me feel old.
but not at all. Like you said these strategies are like as fresh as you keep working on them with different companies, different sets of people. And I remember reading your first round article about superhumans positioning. And I think that was a time that you were talking about positioning exercise. And I think like a lot of early stage founders picked, inputs from what you had built with Superhuman. And I think even the strategy to onboard people through a very personal onboarding and have this sort of a like how disappointed would you be? I still remember that question because everybody who read the article after that, like, oh, so superhuman strategy is to basically use how disappointed a user is when this product is not there. Now let's go build that survey. Like just
Yeah.
let's go do that. So I remember that. Yeah, it really created a wave and shows just like how you mentioned the kind of freshness intact 20 years later with a new product that's racing again. Like whatever is more massive now.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. Let's get a little more into that personality. I think you touched upon personality to the kind of brands that we'll be building and the emotional factor. So can you talk to us more about what do you mean when you say, let's add personality to this branding? What are some examples that you've seen that sticks? And what are some practical ways to get started?
Yeah. So there's some academic research that was done by Jennifer Aker. She was at Berkeley at the time, and she analyzed the brands with the most brand value, in the world.
Mhm.
And she found that all of them came down to having the personalities of these brands. And we're talking about, big Fortune 100 type brands. They came down to spiking in 2 of 5 dimensions of brand personality. And so if you think about, like Rolex, super
Mm.
fancy, right? And like premium, they are sophisticated and competent. Those are the 2. If you
Mm.
think about a brand like Red Bull, right? Like
Mm.
Red Bull, the drink, they are rugged and exciting. So there's like it's very reductive to think like there's only 5 personality attributes or 5 personality dimensions. And if you have a clear personality, you spike in 2 of the 5. And what you
Right.
see is a lot of tech brands end up spiking in sincerity and competence. And if you think about Amazon, Google, they all spike in sincerity and competence.
Mm.
And then, but they feel different, right? So how do they feel different within there? So I always encourage founders, one, to understand those 5 dimensions, and then to figure out which 2 they spike in. And then beyond that, to think of their personality as a 5-point star, the brand's personality as a 5-point star. And the points of the star are each adjectives that you're going to use to describe your brand that reflect those 2 dimensions. So if you think about like those, rugged, exciting brands like the Mountain Dews and the Red Bulls and, those kind of brands, the big dimensions are excitement and ruggedness, but then the attributes might be like rebelliousness, speed, they move fast, they're hip and trendy. Like there's different attributes within that. So I really encourage founders to do this exercise, to pick the 2 and then to pick the 5. And that would be how to start. And then when you end up with 5 adjectives, and the adjectives, like you can do it as a person, as practice. Like I've done it for myself. And then you can do it for your brand. And then once you have the 5 adjectives, you end up writing them in this way. You say like Google is playful, but they're not silly. So you say, I am playful, but not silly. And you write them each like that. And then what you end up having is a little guide that says, we are each of these 5 things, but let's calibrate it. We're not silly. We're not, or maybe we are exciting, but not rebellious, or we are adventurous, but not reckless. And you kind of calibrate each of those. So then you really have like, these are the 5, and you work really hard to pick 5 that work hard for you. And then every time you have a piece of marketing collateral, whether it's a blog post and it's your tone of voice, your website, a podcast you do, whatever it is, you make sure that you're reflecting that personality. That's how I start.
Got it. Yeah, I think it's super interesting. And like these 2 dimensions and the 5 pointers that we pick, these are like words and phrases that you can choose, right? Like, with respect to starting with those 2 dimensions and then going on to define more as adjectives or more like qualifiers of where you would belong, right?
Yeah, the 5 are set. So you pick from a list of 5. The 5 attributes, you pick 2 of them, right? You say, we're going to be these.
And what are those
Then
5?
once
Like,
those 5 are sincerity, excitement, competence, sophistication, and ruggedness. Those are the 5.
Nice.
Yeah. So if you think about any brand, you can map them back to 2 of those 5 if it's a strong brand. So that's how you start. Once you pick those 2, so let's say you picked sincerity and competence, like that's how Google is. Then you go to, within sincerity and competence, I want to create an interesting profile. I don't want to be just sincere and competence, boring. Then all of these brands are the same. So now how do we flesh out 5 adjectives that really show the uniqueness of our personality and ideally have some tension? So like, it's really cool if somebody is, well, this is something I aspire to be. Like I aspire to be really direct, but not brutal. That would be me. And I also aspire to be expert, but not elitist. So like, that's an example where you would say like, okay, well, actually people who are direct, experts are usually not that direct. They usually talk around stuff. So like, those are 2 where there's tension. And so the most interesting brands, just like the most interesting people, have some tension in those 5 adjectives you end up choosing.
Yeah, fascinating. And to me, what I mean like this, you can also apply this as founders or like as people behind those brands. I think the same exercise is applicable for you as a person. And once you figure that out, I think a lot of those times it sort of matches what sentiment you bring to the brand and like, how you would want to project this. Because at times what happens is when you take these products out, people see you as the brand. Like sometimes, there's like a very thin line of separation between you and the brand that you represent in certain cases. And I think those cases, what you mentioned, could be like a great start for folks in the sense that they can start doing this exercise with themselves, get more self-introspective about what works for them and who kind of they are, what fits them, and then apply the same thing. And I think the translation becomes more easy when they get it to the brand now. So
yeah, I think sometimes founders have a hard time thinking of their brand as a person with a personality, and they end up either just reflecting themselves or they go to really functional words, like their website's fast. So they say like, we're speedy. And it's like, well, that's not really a personality attribute, like, what do you actually?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think starting with yourself is great. One thing I would say though is that sometimes the brand and the founder personalities are quite different. And I'll
Yeah.
give you one example. It's great if they're the same because it's easy to be authentically you and the brand, and it's very fluid. And you see that, with a lot of brands that the personality reflects
Mhm.
the founder, as you say. Like people say early days of Facebook was like Mark Zuckerberg's personality. We think of like Glossier, that was her personality, like
Yeah.
it's very mapped, right? Maybe not one to one,
Yeah.
but it's mapped. There are
Yeah.
cases though where like you meet the founder and the brand and you're like, wow, these people are so different. It's harder to pull off, but it's quite possible. And I always think about this one guy I met. I did I did some brand management training at Procter and Gamble,
Mhm.
and I met the brand manager at the time for Old Spice. And Old Spice
Okay.
is the deodorant, men's aftershave, all the saving cream.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
OG.
yeah, exactly. So he actually was a young Black man who had a
Mhm.
degree in chemistry, chemical engineering, and became a brand marketer. He
Yeah.
was the one who was sort of on the team responsible for bringing the swagger back to Old Spice, right? Like, remember, Old Spice used to be something that grandfathers used, and then
Yeah.
they reinvigorated it. It was around like 2005, 2006, 2007, something
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that.
Very old.
Okay. So he, to me, when I met him, I was like, I totally get how the new Old Spice brand reflects this brand manager. It's very, very similar, right? Like I get how he brought the swagger back to Old Spice. And I asked him, what was the brand that you worked on before? Because at Procter and Gamble, they rotate. And he said, Tampax Pearl, which is a tampon.
Yeah.
And that was to me like that good brand managers, it's easy for them when the brand reflects their own sentiment, personality, they are in their own target. And he was such a good brand marketer that he went so deep in understanding both the functional and emotional needs of the tampon user that he could just as easily manage that tampon brand, which is very different from him, and the Old Spice reinvigoration. Now,
Yeah.
most founders aren't like that, right? Most founders, they have to stretch a little bit to be in like doing brand work. And so it's much easier if the brand
Mm.
reflects their personality.
Yeah. No, excellent examples. And like you said, it sounds more of being very dynamic and, of course, a lot of hard work here, right? Because it requires you to first understand you're on a different tangent and the brand is on a different tangent. So, like the amount of bridge work that it would take to get both together, I think that by itself is a very hard task at the first place. And then taking those steps and those two examples are like so bizarre. Like you said, the brand is extremely overwhelming. Like the minute you think the audience that comes to your mind is okay, I think it's my grandpa or like it's probably like old people. But it's amazing to see how much of branding can change people's perception. And yeah, with founders, I guess it's a lot to first do that initial step of understanding, okay, am I like in the same lane as the brand or am I going to be standing perpendicular to it? And then like take the next steps forward.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So now that we're talking about branding, you know, and how founders sometimes misinterpret this, I feel that whenever, let's say, we hear the word branding or we talk to people about branding, often people think it's like buzz, like social media posts or promotions. But there are like so many unseen things, such as what category you belong to, just as how you were pointing some examples to me from luxury or from SaaS or, from food and spice. So there are like multiple categories you belong to and different purposes. So can you tell us some deeper nuances of branding that people don't see beyond just some of these social media buzz perspective of it?
Yeah. So I don't think that social media is branding, just like I don't think your logo is your brand. I think your brand is who people think you are. And that's a very
Hmm.
broad definition. But that to me is the definition I use. Your brand is what people say about you when you're not there. And so everything you do to shape that is part of building your brand. So even your product and what it does and how people experience it, the UX, the name, how you distribute it, all of these choices influence how people see you and what they
Hmm.
would say about you when you're not there. So to me, that's the definition of brand. It's quite large. And then there are certain things that like a brand marketer really cares about that are very tied into company and product strategy. And these are things like understanding your audience, understanding what their problems are, understanding what your solution is, how to talk about it. Those are all the fundamentals of brand strategy. Once you define like that North Star purpose, this is where we're going in 10 years. This is how we're going to make people want to root for us. And then you do your product positioning, which is this is the category in which we play. These are our benefits. These are our differentiators. You have basically part of the story. And then you layer in some articulations of brand, which are more what people think about as brand, which is the look and feel, the colors, the fonts, the way the illustration style is, the typography, the tone of voice, all of that, right? That all comes into play. But to me, that's almost like the icing on the top, right? And
Yeah,
I think a lot of founders think that's brand, like the logo is
exactly.
brand.
Yeah, true. I think those are all like fringes, but there's like more core stuff that you're supposed to focus on. And the reason I asked this question is also because, most folks think, okay, so this logo is not working out. So people might just get a bad branding about me. Or, okay, this social posts are not going up. Or if they see something that's more like a trend, let's say on Twitter, then they're like, oh, that startup's branding was great. I think we should start looking at it more for us. But sometimes those concepts don't match at all. They would have probably done because that trend works for them and for their industry or the category that they belong to, but it not necessarily has to work for the place that you're working at. So I think this is often very delusional because people don't look at it in the right sense, right? So it's very hard.
Yeah. I mean, I really do believe that if you get those fundamentals right, if you really have your strong purpose, your strong product positioning, and your strong personality, they act as the guiding force behind, should our tweet sound like this? Should our ad look like this? Like you can come back to those fundamentals and they'll answer the question for you. And there are a lot of cases where you might see a competitor do something, you're like, oh, we should be doing that. But then if you come back to like, wait, does that fit our personality? Does that fit our product positioning? And it will answer it for you. No, that isn't what we should be
Yeah,
doing. And in fact, we should be doing this other thing.
yeah. I mean, in my personal experience as well, like before, moving into product management, I was in product marketing, and a lot of the work that I did, I remember that I used to come back to, okay, this really makes sense from the personality perspective of the brand that I'm working towards. If I'm going to be talking about this in this angle, would it really be like we're pulling it off in the right way? And sometimes, the answer is a clear no. And you're like, yeah, you take the stand and say, no, I don't think we have to go with this because it's kind of raging out on the internet, because it really doesn't go with your brand. So yeah, I think just some of those practical thinking would really help once you understand the core of who you are and what brand you're trying to put out to people. That's very true. Cool. So now talking about a lot of the brand and all these fringes as well as what would a brand logo look like, or what would a brand name take as a weightage. This is like a fun question. Like from all the brands that you've worked with, what's the most interesting naming strategy that you were a part of? And, do you have like interesting stories or anecdotes that
Oh,
you
yeah.
would like to share?
So many. Oh my gosh. I have to pick one. Whoa. Okay.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
mean, the rule is not one, so out to you
okay.
as many as you want. But yeah,
Okay. I think I've worked on the naming for something like 50 companies now. So it's been
wow.
a lot. Some of them are pretty straightforward and not that interesting, but there's always like some interesting part. I guess one that comes to mind, just because we were talking about it earlier, is with Maven. So
Mhm.
Maven is an interesting example because Goggin and West, the co-founders, had already like started the idea. They knew what they wanted to build, more or less. First round invested in the company, and it had
Mhm.
a different name at the time. It was like a not very good name, but they knew it wasn't a very good name, and they wanted to have a better one. But they
Mhm.
incorporated and like got going with this name. And so they actually ended up like announcing, because they have quite large followings on the
Yeah.
internet from past work. And so they ended up announcing like, we're building this new thing. And we had already done all the positioning work. It's going to be online cohort based courses. This is how it's going to work. And they couldn't announce the name yet because we didn't have it all buttoned up yet. But we knew what we wanted it to be. And so they actually said, like, this is Goggin and West's new thing. Here's what it's about. And then they almost like announced the name once we had acquired the domain and done all the trademark work and everything after the fact, as a like, oh, by the way, it's called Maven. So that was interesting because I never had seen that sort of strategy done before, and they pulled it off quite well. Usually we would have the name first and then announce what the
Yeah,
name and the
yeah.
domain and all that. So that was
So
really
cool.
interesting. I think it worked because both of them had a following in the space. And so
Mm,
they could say like, we are working on a new thing, TBD on the name, and it worked for them. The naming brainstorm for them was super interesting because they really wanted to have a .com, and it was very challenging to get the domain. We had the name picked out months before, but it took actually
mm,
a long, long time to get the domain. One other thing I would say is that a lot of founders will come to me with, I want a new name. I want it to be an English language word and I want the .com, but I'm not willing to spend more than $10,000 on it. And I'm sorry, that just doesn't work anymore. So these days, almost all the like word.com domains are taken and they're prohibitively expensive for early stage startup founders. And so one of the things that
yeah.
I remind people of is you don't necessarily need word.com, right? There's a
Mm,
lot of creative ways to do that. And even if you look at some of the brands that are really large, like Nissan Cars is on nissanusa.com,
mm,
at least their US presence. Square, it's still on squareup.com. They have a
yeah,
redirect from square.com. And so that not having the .com really, it's not going to hurt you that badly. I'd
yeah.
rather you own the .com and you have a variant. And so I always encourage people like, yes, domain matters, but pick the name first and then let's find a
Mm,
domain that's workable. Like that's the order that I really like to work in.
right, right. Very true. I think most often when we think about getting a brand out, especially like releasing it to the audience, we often start with thinking of the name, buying the domain. And I think those are like the first steps. And it's fascinating to know that both me and it was like a different strategy altogether. And you're right, like with when you have an audience that is following you and you have to sort of a direct connect with them. I think this is like a radical approach to just try it out. And I'm glad it worked in David's case. But yeah, it's very, very different from what traditionally happens with rest of the other startup branding, especially like I think there's like a certain amount of pride that people have in taking that, oh, today we're launching and like just getting that website out and then like trying to say just waitlist or like, just go and sign up. We're out in beta or we're out to launch. So yeah, it's really interesting. And you brought a very important point. I think I was sort of getting there myself and you rightly plugged it in the .com thing because you've seen like a lot of new startups, right? Like Notion or Coda, all of these are like .io, .so, and there's like so many newer startups that are coming up without the .com. But I think one of the first OG marketing things was like, oh, you have a brand, then think of a .com domain. So it's good. And I mean, like just to add on to that, is there like a myth that you want to break in terms of like, okay, it's fine if you don't use a .com. There are like other ways that you can still build that sort of a brand authority. Like, have you seen examples of that in the past? Like one example you brought through in our talk now is sort of similar domains to .com, but not exactly like Nissan USA.com or, in that case, it's slightly deviated. But are there like other examples that you can think of where not necessarily that .com should build the authority for the brand? There are like other ways to do it.
Yeah. I think that there are certain companies where it probably does make sense to be on a .com for your audience. But one
Mm,
example that comes to mind is I just recently worked with a startup in the large language model space. They're
mm.
on .ai. It makes sense for their audience. Like they couldn't get the .com they may actually get it. We're looking into it, but they started by launching on, word.ai, and for their audience, that makes perfect sense. So if
Yeah.
you're, selling makeup, you should not be on .ai. It doesn't
Mm.
make sense. But if you're an
No.
AI company, like, yes, be on .ai, it's fine. And so I think most of the time I gravitate towards a .com with a variant of the name and then a
Mm.
.com. If you can't get the original like .com, I think sometimes .co can work. Like if it's a company that you're trying to, I don't know, like I'm thinking of an example. Like there's a company, I haven't worked with them myself. It's just, I know somebody who works there. They're called the Browser Company,
I was just
right?
going to say the browser.co. Yeah, yeah. I've
Yeah,
seen it.
right.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like it's called the Browser Company. Makes sense
yeah,
to have a .co, right?
yeah. True, true. Yeah, yeah. And again, I think this ties back to what you want the name to be. Like, what do you want not just the name, but the larger sense of the product that you're building or the platform that you're building. And then, yeah, then sort of apply that to the domains. So, yeah, that makes sense.
The other thing is a name and a domain are just part of the story. And I think sometimes
Mm,
founders over index on how important that is. I do
yeah,
think naming is important. And I think a great name can help a good company, but a bad name isn't going to like make or break your company as long as people can pronounce it, people can find you, and that you imbue it with meaning. But if you look at some of the brands that we love, like Apple, Disney, Nike, like some of these brands, the logo doesn't the logo by itself, the name by itself, if you just saw it as like a cell in a spreadsheet or a name on a whiteboard, it doesn't come with all the meaning that they've given to it over years and decades of
yeah.
marketing. And so you really have to think about, you have to imbue that name and that logo with all the meaning. It's not the name or the logo that's going to bring you the meaning.
Mm, yeah, very, very important point. Also, like makes me get reminded of some of those luxury brands, right? Where these namings are all mostly after the founders or like those initial folks like Louis
Yeah.
Vuitton, like wherever you go through, I think most of these are like based out of the folks who are initially a part of uh, getting the brand out. Chanel, I think a lot of these are just based out of founders. So if those brands can stick, I guess, like, yeah, it's because they sort of brought that sentiment along with the brand. It was not just about, and the best part for me is these are like very hard to pronounce for folks that are out around the world. But if folks can still relate to some of these brands and like go about buying their products and also like associating with the brand, I think it's also at a certain level of sentiment that they have established with those brands. So yeah.
Yeah, and when we do naming brainstorms, like the last names of people as a, one area to brainstorm is a very
Oh,
viable thing to brainstorm. You see even modern companies that are like this, Tesla is an example. It's named after
like,
Nikola Tesla, who was a really important in electricity. Like so sometimes when you're working on a company, looking at like the last names of famous people who were in the space that you're in is a viable
yeah,
thing to include in your naming brainstorm, not just the last names of the founders.
yeah, true, true. I think I can get reminded of Alfred,
Mhm.
the research, and I think recent fancy example in the AI space was Harvey.ai. So if we follow this series called Suits, and Harvey is the character there who's a lawyer, and this is an app for legal counselors who can use
Mhm.
AI to summarize their work, try and get started with the prompt. So and that was like a fascinating example for me. I'm like, okay, you used the streaming culture where folks are very much known to this particular character from the series, and the audience is right, and the .com, I mean the .ai domain is right. Like nailed it all the points, and then super spot on targeting for the brand. So yeah, awesome. So now, moving on a little into just what we discussed in terms of using some of these words on the website or like just getting to the sentiment of messaging. There are so many B2B brands or SaaS brands, and even taking AI into picture now, I think there are so many commonly overused words and jargons that we necessarily don't realize it, but then we like put it out. I think Speedy was one such example. And there's always like data driven, there's always like the analytics, the dashboard that you need, and like just using fancy terms. So you've spoken in length at many articles and citations about the bar test and the Cinderella spectrum. So could you tell what entails in both of these concepts and how can somebody get started in understanding if they're really using these jargon terms and how to like stop that?
Yes. Jargon, I feel like I'm on a quest against jargon, honestly. Like that is one of the things that I really try to edit out of all of the companies that I work with. There are some words that are just general business jargon that I just cancel out of all messaging.
Mhm.
And these are words like leverage, enable, empower, oh, incentivize. That's not even a word. There's a
Yeah.
lot of words that I just like cross out, and utilize. That's another one. Cross it out, put use. Like there are words that you just should not be using. And one of the reasons that I think you should not be using them is that your target audience doesn't speak like that. And you mentioned two of the frameworks that I like to use. The Cinderella spectrum is really just a way to map out your benefit. So if you think
Mhm.
about your benefit, it can be quite functional, or it can be very emotional, or it can be somewhere in the middle. So I'll give you some examples. If you think about Peloton, I'm a huge Peloton fan. The functional benefit, which was actually their homepage messaging when they first launched, was join studio cycling classes from the comfort of your home. That is exactly what it is. Like when
What
they
they
had
do.
only the bike and streaming classes, right? Join studio cycling classes from the comfort of your home. We can understand it. It's a great summary. It's a great H1 message for their homepage. Now, a lot of their messaging is like, together we go far, be the best version of yourself. It's much more on the emotional side. They earned the right to do that because we all understand what Peloton is. If they had come out and talked about together we go far, and we did not know that it was a spin bike, premium subscription with a nice piece of hardware that you put in your living room that emulated the spin classes that you used to go to a studio for, that would make no sense. And so a lot of founders, they go right to the together we go far before they've explained and earned the right to say that. And so the Cinderella Spectrum is just a fun little exercise where if you think about the story of Cinderella, which we all know, on the very functional side, this is the Disney princess tale. She was a girl who grew up with fairy godmothers. And then one day she found out they were magical and they turned her pumpkin into a chariot and she went to a ball. That is the functional story. On the very emotional side of the story, she lived happily ever after with like her dream life, blah, blah, blah. And in the middle, it was like she went to the ball with the glass slipper. She married a prince. And so you can kind of map out any story, whether it's your company story. I use Cinderella as an example, from the functional to the emotional. So on the Peloton one, the functionals join studio cycling classes from the comfort of your home. The emotional one's about together we go far. And they have stuff in the middle too, which is like the bike that's ready when you are. Like that's kind of in the middle. So anyway, you can do that for your company, and I would encourage people to do. And then if you're an early stage founder, I would err on the side of functional. And then I would grow into the more emotional, even though you want to be aware of the emotions that your target user has. For Peloton, it's about, I can push myself when I work out hard by myself, but I don't really try. I don't have time to go to the spin class anymore. I don't go as often, or when I go, I have to drive and it takes so long. They knew exactly what they were tapping into. So yeah, that's one. That's the Cinderella spectrum. So map out your benefits from functional to emotional and then try to err on the side of functional. And the bar test is really a role-playing exercise to get away from all the jargon. And what that is you pretend you're two people at a bar in your target audience, and you have the first person say, "Oh my gosh, I just started using product name." And then the other person goes, "Oh, cool. What is it?" And the first person has to go, "It's this new category that benefit." That's all. And they have to say what you wrote down as your category and your benefit. Now, if they have to say, "It's this new all-in-one analytics platform that enables me," like they're just not going to say that. And so it gets you away from using those words. So that's the first step. And then the second step is, after you nail your category and benefit, back to the role play. It's this new category that benefit. The other person goes, "Huh, cool. Tell me more." Or, "Huh, cool. How does it do that?" And then the other person goes, "Well, unlike competing alternative, it differentiator." And they really have to say those things out loud. And you have to keep editing until you get to a place where this is something that two people in your target would actually say to each other when they weren't there. Back to the idea of what's a brand? It's what people say about you when you're not there, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. Like so many practical examples from that. And oftentimes I think with bar tests especially, you can catch hold of people because you can word some of these like it's too much full marks, and you're like, okay, wait, what did I like just say that? And it's all nice when you see it on the website, but I think
Yes.
when you're just more like doing the word of mouth thing, okay, wait, did I really say it's the all-in-one and like it's dashboard and sort of use these words? I think it's really fun. Oh my god, I'm more excited to try this out with most of the brands that I know and like really get. And one of the benefits I see in this case is you can, let's say you missed out a certain sentiment or a word, and you sort of get so many examples from people. And like, let's say somebody's just said something about the brand, and you're like, oh, wait, I think this is a good word that I can catch. And I didn't think about this. And I think this is like a good, input for you to take back and work. So very,
Yeah. I
very
mean,
practical.
honestly, how your users talk about your product, like this is back to, understanding your customer. Sometimes they say it better than you do. Right? And so, yeah, you wanna hear how they say it. You wanna ask them because you want their words to be used. And it's funny, I almost became a copywriter when I was about 25. I, like, had to right? And so, yeah, you wanna hear how they say it. You wanna ask them because you want their words to be used. And it's funny, I almost became a copywriter when I was about 25. I, like, had a path in my career where I was gonna fork, like, should I keep doing this marketing thing or do I really like writing? I'm glad I
Mm,
stuck with marketing. It's much more broad. But I almost
yeah.
became a copywriter, and it's funny, like, one of the things that copywriters do, it's kinda like what comedians do, is they just listen to how people talk, and then they write that down, and then they put it in an ad. Like, it that there's a lot more to it than that, but that's one of the
Yeah.
strategies. Like, just be a good listener.
Yeah, yeah, it's like doing improv, basically, like just running your own improv, and like that's the way you put out the brand strategy as well. Like, as much as possible, pick what's live in action, like what's going on with people, and adapt that to the way that you want to go about. I think with both of these strategies, I like how simple and also like very practical they are. And oftentimes, I think people rely a lot on frameworks, and for that fact, frameworks should take you a step forward. So it's not about just filling those in the documents and like just looking at it at a document level and just say, no, I like filled in the fancy template and I'm like happy now. But I think these both are pushing people more towards the edge in terms of trying them out. And like, I like how they're very iterative. So yeah, it's great. And like, have you been suggesting this to like these early stage brands that you've been working with? Like, do they do some of these exercises
Oh,
and like,
yeah. Yeah, we did. I work with 8 companies at a time at first round, and
Mhm.
so they all go through the positioning, personality, and purpose exercises with me, and we do talk about those. And then through my Maven class, we do exactly that. Like, we learn the bar test, we role play it in breakouts, like, we are using it. So, I really believe in simple frameworks that get you somewhere where you could actually use the output. Because I agree with you
Yeah.
that there's a lot of templates where it's like, cool, now I have this doc. What do I do with it? And in this case, we map exactly what you say in the bar test to like how you might translate that to your website.
Mm. True, very true. Yeah. And this takes me into this lane, a lot of this is involving like, okay, you sit and work on the basics, like understand your core purpose, then there's like the product to build, and then we take it to the audience. So sometimes when founders are like, let's say I'm more of an early stage builder, and oftentimes I'm the only person on the team, and there's like a lot of these buckets of things for me to do. So for those kind of solopreneurs or very, very smaller teams, like a handful of people working in the teams, how would you suggest as the first things to focus on, and then keep building on that iteratively as the team grows as well? Like, are there like, examples you've suggested to the teams that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time, the teams that I work with are like 3 people with an idea. Like, they're
Exactly.
really early.
Yeah.
And one of the things I like about these frameworks is they can be used at that level. Like, you can do
Mhm.
this even if you're a solo person. You can do this. You can talk to some people who are in your target. You can bounce it off them. You can validate. I really believe in having like 100 conversations with people in your target early on. And the crisper you get your messaging so that the first half of your conversation is all about understanding them and their needs. And the second half of your conversation can be about sort of sharing some of your early messaging. Well, what do you think of that? What do you think that means? Would that be appealing to you? Have you ever bought something like that in the past? Like, you can prompt them with some of your
Mm.
message and you're almost like concept testing what you're building. So I don't think this is something only for large teams. I think this is from the very beginning. You can use these exercises. And then as you have a marketer, as you have a marketing team, you may come
Mm.
back and refresh this. I mean, it's the kind of thing that ideally your purpose wouldn't change in 10 years, but your positioning really is on like a year, 18-month
Yeah.
time frame, and it will evolve as your product evolves and as you have multiple products too.
Yeah, and I think that's where the spectrum would make more sense, and the spectrum also keeps, getting revised as your offering, as what you're building keeps expanding. Then I guess the spectrum and the positioning, the messaging, along with that keeps dynamically getting better. And a lot of messaging, I think, oftentimes people confuse between what is positioning and like what is messaging. So I think a lot of what we are talking about is like understand where which category you belong to, and once you get that right, I think messaging is basically like using what your users are going to tell you about, just using their own words and like trying to use that back into the brand, so there's like a lot of relatability.
Yeah. How I think about it is positioning is an internal strategy of what is the position you want to occupy in your target audience's mind. I didn't make that up. There's a great book. It's from 1981 called Positioning. It's
Mm,
really good. It's like you can read it in a night. But so that your position is the internal choices that you're making of where you want to be, how you want to be perceived. Messaging is what is the language? What is the way that you're going to take that positioning and actually communicate it externally to
mm.
your potential users?
Yeah, yeah, true. And just as the last cut off to what we're just talking about in the same topic of getting this branding right with people, when we use some of these techniques, let's say talk to people early on, see how they're bouncing off your brand and what are they saying about your brand. Does this strategy also work for people? There are like flooded markets, right, where in the same category you have like a bunch of tools. In the same space you have multiple other competitors, and not always do we have the advantage, or I would say like disadvantage, in starting as the single product in that category. Oftentimes we have other competitive brands to look at. So how would you place the role of these competing brands, especially when all of you at the early stage are all trying to provide the same sort of things, but at the same time you have to get your branding in a certain specific way that suits you. So what would you advise in this case?
Yeah, I guess there's two parts to what you asked. The first part is when you're positioning, how much do you think about competitors in your category and how much do you think about being first? There's a
Mm,
lot of people who think that being first in your category is the only way to win. I disagree with that. I think there's a time and a place for category creation, and it is not for
mm,
every business.
mm,
If you are clearly playing in, think about like greenhouse and lever, like if you are an ATS and you say you're something else and everyone else is like, no, no, they're an ATS, there's no point in creating a new category. So they're playing a category and they are competitive with each other. So when you're doing your positioning work, one of the missteps that I see a lot of founders make is over indexing on other competitors who are startups in your space and not on the old way of doing things, which is what
mm.
most of their target audience is doing today. So if you have a bunch of new competitors in your space and you're all little startups and the old way of doing things was doing this, I don't know, whatever your B2B SaaS tool was in like spreadsheets and manually, you're up against spreadsheets and manual work. You're not up against those other competitors. And so really reframing that to be like, what is my audience doing today? How are they solving their problem? If what you're up against is another competitor, like, and
Mm,
there's an entrenched player, that's what they're doing today, then you have to position it against that. And it doesn't mean you have to create a new category, but it means you have to be different. And either you have
mm,
to be different because you solve a different audience, you either are bringing, more lay people into an expert thing, you're serving super users, so you could be different on audience level. You could be different from a price perspective, although like being cheaper is always a race to the bottom.
mm.
You can be better, but better is like also kind of a race. And I suggest
Yeah.
being different and figuring out what is it that makes you different. And there's something
Mm,
about it, and you really want to play up that difference. If there's a commodity product, think about cars, think about makeup, think about cereal, like all these commodity soap, right? Like there's a
mm,
million choices and they all have their niche. And some of them compete for the same niche. And what do they differentiate on? Often brand, often
mm.
how good it is, price, but often it's just what makes them different. And like, I like this particular, brand and you like that particular brand, and we have our reasons. And it might
Yeah.
be that we're in different target audiences. It might be because the brand personality, but really, really the most advice I have when you're playing in lots of competition, play up what makes you different.
Mm. Yeah, so true. And there's like a lot of shared lessons, just as you mentioned, that one can take from our everyday, physical products, what we see in front of our eyes, very tangible. And when we work in software or when we like position some of these digital tools, we forget the fact that some of what we touch, feel, and sense is very much applicable to how people take decisions for buying digital products as well. So I mean, it takes me back to this Gmail example that we discussed at the start of this chat, doing things that are very different, despite the fact that you had Hotmail, you had Yahoo, and all of them in the same category. I think somewhere you rekindle the nostalgia with the letter, with the stickers, those little caring things that mattered. So I guess, yeah, like seeing how different you can be in your strategy and also in your offering. Yeah, that really makes sense. And
Yeah, and for
what
Gmail, it was about storage space, right? It was about we gave you a gig. No one else could give you a gig. A gig nowadays is like not that big a deal, but back then it was a big
back
deal,
then,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, back
And
then
so
it was
it was huge. I was like deleting my messages in my AOL account before then because you couldn't keep them all. So the idea of that was the product differentiator. We give you a gig. No one else is giving you a gig. And what does giving you a gig allow? It allows you to keep all your messages and search through them instead of hunting and pecking for the right one.
yeah, yeah.
Right. So that was the product positioning. And that was what made us different. And then it was so crazy to give you a gig. What else could we do that was kind of crazy? Right, and that's where we got to, like, stickers and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when I was listening to one of the other podcasts where the first engineer who worked on Gmail, I think he was sharing his thoughts on how back then with emails that we used to get, and we had dial-up modems, and like even basically like sending email from one client to another was like sort of a very huge task back then. And then just as how you said, there's like storage space. There was no concept of storage space back until like Gmail brought that up. It was more like I received the email, I open up, I don't know, like there's no threads, like there's no replies. Every reply comes as a different email back then. So I think Gmail brought it up in terms of like giving you a threaded reply, giving you like sort of a very neat way to look at your content, like look at the mails that you've got. I think yeah, that's like understands the differentiator for the brand and keeps moving forward. So and one of the other things that you rightly said was are you racing against an alternative, which is like an Excel sheet, or like are you going against a brand or competitor by itself? When I had April Dunford earlier in my podcast during the initial days, she brought in the same example where she said, like, are you racing against an alternative, which could be like an intern or it could be like an Excel sheet, like people don't think about it. The minute they think it's competitors, they just go and say, okay, let's go A, B, C brands. But I think they forget the fact that the same work could actually be done by an intern or could actually be replaced by some other sorts. So yeah, very
Yes,
true.
yes, that's a really common mistake, and I work with so many companies that it's like, "Oh, what are you positioning against? What's the competing alternative?" It's some other startup that nobody's heard of. I'm like, "Why are you positioning against them? None of your users are using them." They're using these old manual processes. They're using a dusty box of records in the construction office. They're using an intern, and really thinking about going back to it all comes back to understanding the audience, right? And what are they doing today? And now you have to explain how you're different and better versus what they're doing today, not versus some other competitor that they haven't even heard of.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Oh my God, yeah. Wow, this chat was amazing, Ariel. I think we discovered so many stories. The best part was going into a lot of these practical stories that you've been through from your experiences. And I think we touched upon a lot of branding in terms of like core basics of it, and also like trying to understand how to get through many layers of branding and those do's and don'ts in a very, very fun way. So thank you so much for sharing all these nuggets with us and yeah, like being here and giving all these thoughts to us.
Thanks for having me. It was really fun to talk. I love talking about this stuff. I could talk about this stuff forever, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I can see that, and like a lot of good stories. And the next time, I mean, I would love to bring you back on like a part two where I'm not going to stop you and say, give me one story, but I think it's just going to be like, okay, we're on a story marathon. Let's just go. Like all the big companies, let's start. So I think it's great having you here. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks so much.